As a young lad in the early 2000s, I got introduced to a lot of media at a really early age. Shows like Blue's Clues, Cyber Chase, Dragon Tales, What's New Scooby-Doo, and many, many others really influenced the person I would eventually become. But at the time, I just really liked all the pretty colors and cool action. While I have my mom and dad to thank for fostering the creative side of my interests so well, these shows definitely helped shape them. Specifically, I remember getting a Dragon Tales costume one year for Halloween, and I didn't take this thing off for about 2 years. I was so hyper fixated on how it made me feel that it makes sense why now I'm so obsessed with TV and movies as an art form. I love going to the movies, even if I go by myself, making my wife watch weird shows at home, and jumping into a new show that my friend recommended to me 6 months ago. But since I have commitment issues, I just now decided to watch, only for it to become the centerpiece of all of my obsessions for the next 3 weeks. But you guys aren't here to watch me reminisce and wonder why time is moving so much faster now when before it felt so much slower. No, you're here to watch me make 3D art and maybe have a few light chuckles along the way. So let's jump into the point of this Will Yummy Kid Nightcore video of mine. That's right, you guys are in for a special one today. Because outside of making 3 whole 3D posters, I'm actually going to be adding more to my plate. Because it's not like I have a 9-to-5 outside of YouTube, a dog at home, or any other important responsibilities that I need to take care of. So yeah, we're going to be animating them as well. This might be a terrible idea, but I'm gonna leave that pain and suffering to future William. Style-wise, I really loved this diorama and Viewmaster-y kind of look recently. So these are going to fall into that camp just a little bit. But with all that being said, let's jump into the first 3D animated poster of the day. One of the best written shows of all time, Breaking Bad reveals a sense of desperation and pride that few shows have ever revealed before. There are a lot of really, really, really good episodes and a few divisive ones, one of which I want to focus on today, The Fly. If you haven't seen this episode, just know that it's a bald guy with cancer who's really good at cooking crystal meth and his druggy sidekick chasing a fly around a state-of-the-art meth lab for a whole hour. If you have seen this episode, then you understand that the fly actually represents the guilt of Walter. But I won't break down how a simple housefly can reveal impending doom and the pride of a man who has lost himself this time. But yeah, I want to capture all of that in a super cartoony way, almost like one of those old Tom and Jerry chase scenes. But first, we need to make a 3D version of the Super Lab. Recently, I've had a lot of fun taking real-life places or sets and condensing them down into this 8x10 box or square. It makes you look at the most important parts of a scene, and I just love this dollhouse kind of vibe. It really reminds me of those old I Spy books where they would take photography and little miniatures and create really creative scenes. For the actual lab, I'm using a lot of assets from Blender Kit to really flesh out the scene and give it a lot of life. Little things like a fire extinguisher, little bottles, or industrial piping can really add a lot to a boring scene. Ultimately, when I'm working on a composition like this, I like to use a reference photo throughout the whole process. This also allows me to work in layers. Essentially, by layers, I mean that I'll work from the foundation up. So in this case, I'll build the actual room that the lab is in first. This includes the lab equipment, the main lights, and obviously the walls that contain the lab itself. Then I can start to add the little final details, like all the piping and little bottles here and there to really add to the realism of the scene. And with that, we have a completed super lab, ready to cook up the best crystal meth you've ever had. And as I've made more of these, I always stop at this point because there's something so liminal about the result. I can't really explain it, but it looks like a place I've been before, in a dream or in another life. Like, life is supposed to be here, but it isn't. I just love places like that. I actually have a whole album in my phone of little images that I'll take here and there of places that make me feel the same way. So it may be I'm walking by an empty apartment complex or walking through a hotel. There's just something about those in-between places that is so eerie, but also so comforting at the same time. So yeah, I just like to kind of sit here. It's cool, I guess. All right, here comes the absolute beast of this whole project, the characters. If you haven't yet learned this about me, I love diving into things I've never done before, like making a YouTube channel or creating 300 posters in 300 days. And ultimately, I feel like I'm always chasing the next chapter of my art. And before I dive into that next chapter, I'm always asking myself that question of, why wouldn't I be able to do this? Because genuinely, if it's something I'm passionate in or inspired by, why not? Nobody's trying to stop me from making a whole YouTube video or learning a whole part of a program I've never learned before in my spare time. The only person trying to stop me is myself. And I don't know if you guys knew this, but you can tell yourself to stop telling yourself to stop. And that's just a little nugget of wisdom from the Dome of William Designs for you. Take that and eat it. So that brings me here. Making the character, as you've seen behind me, is the easy part. It's really just a bunch of shapes and spheres kind of thrown together to resemble Walter White. But here's where I really struggled. In order to animate a character like this, you have to rig it, which basically means you give this flesh bag here some bones that allow it to move and rotate, kind of like we do. In theory, this seems pretty easy, but this mustache boy here really struggled. First, I made a whole skeleton of bendy bones, courtesy of this tutorial here. Thank you, Southern Shoddy, for all that you do for the Blender community. And honestly, I was super happy with the cartoon vibe that this gave, especially the little bendy arms. Those are great. So I did a little test render to see how this looked and immediately knew that I needed to pivot to something else. You see how the characters kind of slide across the floor? We can't have that. Also, there's no personality here. They just have little wiggle arms. So I scrapped it and moved on. Here's where that feeling of why not came in. Because when I first started this video, I wanted to avoid doing a walk cycle at all cost. I had it in my mind that I was a poster maker and 3D artist, not an animator. But that's dumb. Why should I put a box around myself? Let's step out of that box and tell myself to stop telling myself to stop. So I dove into the best resource that we have today, YouTube tutorials, which not only taught me how easy it was to animate once you had a dedicated rig in place, but how much these animations could bring a 3D character to life. I mean, look at the difference here in Walter. Our little boy can walk now. He's just growing up so fast. So, with the completed walk cycle, I brought our drug duo into the Superlab scene to begin animating our 3D poster. My idea is to create 4 different scenes. The first being a rework of the original running scene that we had with the wiggly arms, a fly POV scene, Jesse falling from the roof in some weird and wacky way, and then an explosion simulation to add some oomph to the final result. Here's a quick note of how I made each of those happen. For the original running scene, I just brought in my new walk cycle and posed the characters in a way that looks like they're running towards the camera. For the fly POV scene, I used the camera as the fly's point of view to give it some erratic movement and have it kind of fly through the scene. Then I had it end with Walter hitting it out of the air with the fly swatter. This is where having a rig is huge, because all I had to do was move Walter's arm a little bit and make it simulate it's hitting something out of the air. It looks pretty cool in my opinion. For Jesse jumping off the balcony, I keyframed him into the very moment he hit the ground. Then we'll use a very fancy editing technique called a match cut to remove those objects as soon as that happens. Then we can have a little blob puddle thing show up at that very moment to make it seem like he jumped off and smushed himself into the ground. For the explosion scene, I'm using a rigid body simulation, which is a mouthful of words that probably don't mean a ton to you. But essentially, I'm giving each of these boxes a constraint. So when they hit something like the wall or lab equipment, they kind of fall and simulate an explosion. Then I can animate a force field, which literally feels like magic to simulate the explosion happening. This is insane that we can do this. That I can literally take a free software and create a whole explosion. So cool. So cool. But with that, our scenes are done, and I can finally bring them into After Effects in order to edit them together and give it some chromatic aberration, grain effects, and a blurred border. This kind of leans into the stop motion style that I'm going for and gives it that vintagey kind of feel. I'll also add some sound effects courtesy of Freesound, which, if you've never used Freesound, is an incredible resource to get sound effects and music and all kinds of stuff. But with that, my dear Will Yummy Army, we have a completed Breaking Bad animated 3D poster for you to consume. Imagine with me for a moment that you could separate your work life from your home life. Sounds like a pretty good idea. Your work self gets to go to work and enjoy all the perks of a 9-to-5, such as meetings and retirement, while your home self gets to enjoy the freedom of being home. Well, Severance takes this idea and pushes it to the max. Obviously, nothing scary or horrifying happens along the way. If you haven't seen Severance, I won't spoil anything for you here, but basically there's this company that allows you to sever your work self from your home self. There's a lot more to it, and it's absolutely insane and so creative and so inspiring, so please go watch it. In art, shows, or movies, I love when a creator takes a genre and shifts it just enough to be something new but familiar. Severance feels like a sci-fi thriller, but it also feels like something so much more. The sets, music, themes, and locations are left pretty barren and really lean into the emptiness of it all. Just like how the backrooms rely on your own perception of loneliness to reveal a place that's in between two other places. A place that really shouldn't be focused on, but begs to be focused on anyways. I really eat that stuff up, so I want to capture that feeling and the reversal of the norm by turning these characters into wooden puppets, as you've seen behind me here. Basically, if you're up to date with the William Designs lore, then you understand that I'm pretty afraid of puppets. And I think it's because they fit into this uncanny and liminal category super well. So I thought they'd be perfect for the liminal world of Severance. For the characters, I'm using a couple action figures as a reference point in order to get the overall joints and body shape down. Then, to emulate the wood, I'm using a wood texture and a couple of sculpting tools to make it look like it had some carved edges. Now, with my newfound knowledge of rigging, I can create a walk cycle. For this, I'm using a 2D animation guide to help me work frame by frame to get the most realistic walk I can. And honestly, it's pretty far from perfect. But practice does make perfect, so the more that I do this, hopefully the better I get. But it does kind of look like a wooden puppet walking, so I'm happy. Now to create the world, which I'm basing off of 3 common scenes that you see throughout the show: the elevator, the hallways, and the office. Each of these are, weirdly enough, characters in their own way, and even after seeing the show years ago, still stick with me. It's amazing how a director can take a simple location like a hallway or elevator and make it dynamic enough to where it feels constricting or lonely. Obviously, writing and acting are crucial for these scenes to make sense, but without the set design and environment, you would lose the tone and that ever-important atmosphere. While Severance is far from the only show to build this beautiful marriage of set design, acting, writing, and tone, it does so in a way that makes it feel like it has a story to tell, like there's passion behind each of those pieces, which is so different from the overwhelming amount of content that we see today, which I think is why I feel so inspired every time I find myself going back to it. So, in a roundabout way, that's what I want these miniature sets behind me here to feel like. And yeah, I'm just copying what's already there, but I want to make sure that this animated poster shows the most inspiring parts of Severance to me. That being the insane set design and how that set design makes me feel. Confused, lost, and a little unsettled. These little sets were extremely satisfying to create, especially the little office scene here. And it's honestly a lot like Legos for me. I love having the instructions in the form of set photos that give me little items that I need to create in 3D. Then having to figure out how to create those with the different shapes and restraints that I've given myself is just way too much fun. Maybe you don't think that, and if that's so, then you're the weirdo, not me. Once I had the sets completed, it was time to bring in the characters and start animating. Here's a quick breakdown of all the different scenes and how I made this happen. For the elevator scene, I brought in the original walk cycle and animated Mark entering the elevator. I also utilized 3 different cameras to give the scene a bit more depth and dimension. This also allowed me to skip animating the legs as Mark turned around. Creating a whole walk cycle for this video was hard enough as is. For the third camera, I'm actually using a dolly zoom, since this is where the severance between the home and work life actually happens. I love this trick. If you don't know what a dolly zoom is, essentially you move a camera towards a subject while zooming out. This gives the illusion that the world around the subject is moving while the subject is actually staying completely still. For the hallway scene, I wanted to make this super simple. So I brought in the original walk cycle, tracked the camera to that walk cycle, and made it look like Mark was walking down this never-ending corridor. I originally wanted to make this look like a maze and that he was twisting and turning to get to the office, but I didn't have the patience to figure that one out. For the office scene, I wanted to do the jazz party. 1, because I love jazz, and 2, because it's one of the few times when the show switches from the sterile office environment to this weird disco atmosphere. It only adds to the mystery of the show, and it's just such a stark and sudden change that I just love it. It's also just gonna look cool, so. First, I can bring in the characters and animate their rigs in weird and wacky ways to make it look like they're dancing. This also allows me to lean into the puppetry aspect of it all by making the animations very rigid. I can also make this a party by animating the emission texture on the ceiling, basically changing it from red to blue to white throughout the animation. To be honest, I wasn't super happy with this scene. I feel like the lights emission texture could have been a little bit stronger to lean into the disco vibe more, and the characters, while rigid and very puppet-like, are just a little bit too weird in their animations. You'd think living in this 24-year-old body of mine, I'd have a better idea of how to dance, but alas, I am just as rigid as these puppets. I still like the end result, but again, just need to get more reps, I think, with animation to get better at it. Finally, we can bring all of these scenes into After Effects, edit them together, add a lot of the same effects from the Breaking Bad poster, add some jazzy music, add some color adjustments, and with that, we have a completed 3D animated Severance poster for your friends and family to enjoy together while you recite the 9 core principles of our precious, precious, precious Lumen Industries. Man, I could talk about this show for hours, about how it perfectly captures the need for childlike wonder, how it reveals that hope and faith requires sacrifice, how it stresses the importance of self-acceptance in that hope, and many, many more themes. It's amazing to me that all of these extremely deep and wide ideas can be fit into such a small and unsuspecting little animated package. Honestly, these themes hit pretty close to home for me, because growing up, I wanted to be anything but who I was, which I feel is extremely common across the board. But as I've gotten older, much like the journey that Wirt and Greg went on in Over the Garden Wall, I've gained a sense of confidence in who I am, and thankfulness in it as well. And I think it's because of the struggles, the triumphs, the failures, and the blessings along the way. It doesn't mean that I still don't struggle, but it means that I can find hope in that struggle. It means that I can find hope over the garden wall. So with this little animated 3D poster, I want to focus on that journey by making this a love letter to Over the Garden Wall. My idea is to have Wirt and Greg walking in one place while the scenes around them change to show a few of the main plot points from the show. But first, we've got to make the little guys. When this video comes out, they would have already released the 10-year anniversary stop-motion short for Over the Garden Wall, which utilized these little wooden puppets. So, to continue with the theme of puppetry, I wanted to utilize these versions in my poster. Ultimately, a lot of the ideas here are super similar to that of the Severance poster. So that means action figure type limbs, sculpted body pieces to simulate wood carvings, and very simple shapes. All made to look like the infamous duo, of course. Since, for some reason, I decided to center this poster on Wirt and Greg walking, that means we're back to creating a dedicated rig and walk cycle for these little boys. And wow, just like that, we have a completed walk cycle. Little do you know that I made this poster a little bit later than the other ones, which means your boy here completely forgot how to make a rig and walk cycle during that time frame. I don't know exactly what happened, but I made all of the same mistakes, which means I had to make these rigs over and over and over again. But with a rig in place and a couple little bouncy walk cycles created, which I have to say are probably my best so far, it's time to take these boys on an adventure. Here's the plan. First, I want to make a simple forest scene to make sure that I can make this endless walking loop function correctly. With that being said, I also want to have 3 other scenes to make this effect, well, effective. The first being of the big pumpkin god, who is actually a nice little guy, one of the frog band, and finally one little surprise for the true OTGW fans out there. All right, jumping into it here with the first scene. Before animation or anything, I wanted to get a basis of how this could actually work. My first idea, as you can see behind me here, was to create these boxes that functioned as transition points between the different scenes. But I quickly realized that this wasn't going to work, especially if each box and scene had different lighting that would spill over into the next. So I moved on to creating this in a massive scene-by-scene basis. But I made another mistake. Essentially, instead of moving the whole environment, I decided to move the characters and the camera across the whole scene, then use these little black bars here as the transition points to the next scene. But that didn't exactly work. In theory, this would work fine, but it just didn't necessarily accomplish the effect that I was going for. So I decided to move on yet again. And I'm so glad I did, because this time really landed the plane for me. Whatever that means. Basically, the solution that I found was to parent everything in the scene that wasn't the camera, characters, or border to an empty object. Then I can keyframe that empty object to move the whole scene while the characters remain in place. This gives the illusion that the characters are walking across the scene, but saves me a ton of time in editing later. I know, that was quite a lot of trial and error, but this is where I cannot get enough of the 3D design process. If you're a gamer, then you definitely know about Dark Souls, and you probably know about how difficult it can be as well. But let me tell you, From Software, the developers of Dark Souls, sure did nail the satisfaction that you can get once you beat a boss that you've been stuck on for literal hours. That feeling of pure bliss and satisfaction is insane because you feel like you've accomplished something that nobody else could. You defeat the impossible odds, you could say. That's kind of how I felt in this moment. And yeah, it's a small moment in the grand scheme of things, but I can't explain to you how satisfying it is to find a solution to a specific problem like this in a very complicated and very difficult to understand software sometimes. Oh, real quick, for the actual forest scene here, I used a bunch of free assets from BlenderKit in order to populate the scene with a ton of trees, little pieces of grass, and the path. I also created these emission cones to make it look like the sunlight was poking through the trees in a really fantasy and magical way. I think it fits really well with the overall wooden puppet kind of vibe that I'm going for. After rendering this out for literally days of my life, it was time to make our big ol' pumpkin boy. For Enoch, I used a sphere with a few Boolean modifiers to create his eye holes and the mouth. Then I used a plane with an array modifier to create the skirt around his big head. I also used a wave modifier to give the skirt some movement so that it kind of looks like he's constantly thrusting. For the actual animation piece, I brought in a few curves to act as ribbons. Then I can animate those curves over time to make it look like little arms are coming out of Enoch to grab our dear brothers as they walk by. Then we can bring that boy into our original scene, add some fog, crates, and pumpkins here and there, make sure that all of those are parented to the original empty so that it follows the original animation. And with that, we have a spooky little barn for our duo to walk through. All right, I have a confession to make. I completely forgot to record myself making this next part of the video. I think it must have slipped to the mind of old past William here that this was a crucial piece. But basically, I created some 3D wooden frog puppets, gave them some little instruments, and animated them in a really rigid way to make it look like they were frog puppets playing instruments. I also placed them on a stage above our main characters a little bit because it looked cool. I know that's not lore accurate at all, but again, it looks cool. But that's the third scene for you. And with that, we can go over the garden wall together as we watch this 3D animated poster made by William Designs on this side of the screen that you're watching on that side of the screen in a YouTube video. Again, make sure that you stick around until the end because I have a little surprise for the true Over the Garden Wall fans out there. You thought I forgot about the best character in fiction ever? You fools. I am the highwayman. I make ends meet. I also think that this guy might be the love of my life, to be honest. So, here we are at the end of a very animated William Designs video. This one was an absolute beast to create. You could say there were a lot of moving pieces and parts, but I'm extremely happy with how the 3D animated posters came out. It makes me want to dive into this medium just a little bit further. So I have a few ideas, so stay tuned. I also wanted to take this time to say thank you. Thank you for watching, liking, and commenting on all of these little videos of mine. The amount of support has been truly overwhelming, and it just kind of blows my mind that people actually like to watch these. So, thank you. More than anything though, I hope that these videos inspire you to create. I hope that they inspire you to create something new, something different, something that you're uncomfortable with. Because you never know where your art could take you and who you could be at the end of it all. So, go do whatever you do best. I never know how to really end these things. I feel like I should have like a dubstep outro or something like that.